that day, if our positions were switched, would our fates be different? Would I have your life and you mine?
Being a Devil May Cry fan kind of felt like being stuck in purgatory for a while there. We'd been left hanging on the same mysteries and setups presented in Devil May Cry 4 with no follow-through for over 11 years. And even that game didn't do much to answer the questions we'd had since the first DMC from 7 years prior. That's nearly 2 decades of lingering questions, dealing with the same handful of characters and locations. Thankfully, Devil May Cry 5 was just what the series needed. A sequel that tied up many of the plot threads presented in the previous games, while simultaneously putting it all in a fresh context, with new heroes, villains, concepts, settings, imagery, and revelations. This same idea of tying up the old within the context of something new is represented perfectly in the game's new villain, Urizen. Sometime after the events of DMC4, a towering hive-like structure suddenly sprouted from the ground in the middle of Redgrave City. At its center, this giant red demon, taken shape through a series of twisting, vein-like roots, sits casually slouched upon his throne. This is Urizen, who claims the title of Demon King, and Dante is hired by a mysterious man calling himself V to go in and slay this monster. He heads into this hive with Trish and Lady alongside him, but when the game first begins, we see Urizen unfazed and uninterested as the normally incredibly powerful Dante gives his everything, unable to dent the force field that surrounds him. Urizen's face is obscured by a demonic crown that wraps around his head, which Dante wouldn't be able to scratch if he wanted to. Nero arrives to try to help him, with V reminding him that this same demon took his Devilbringer arm and used it to become this powerful. Before the game's events, while working in his garage, a cloaked figure came out of nowhere and ripped his arm right off of him. This demonic arm contains the powerful demon blade Yamato, which atomized into it once Nero came into contact with the sword in DMC4. This attacker turns the arm back into the Yamato and says he's taking it back, before using the blade to slice a portal through the fabric of reality, leaving Nero to bleed out on the floor. The Yamato was once wielded by the legendary Dark Knight Sparta, who fought back against demonkind to protect humanity and seal their worlds away from each other. He fell in love with a human named Eva, who gave birth to 2 twin brothers, Dante and Vergil, who shared both human and demonic blood. Before he disappeared, Sparta left mementos for his sons, including the swords Yamato given to Vergil and Rebellion for Dante. After Vergil's defeat in the prequel DMC3, his sword was broken in half. It was researched by a religious sect who worshipped Sparta as their god, who aimed to piece it back together. Only after being in the presence of Nero and his demonic arm, which suddenly appeared on him one day, would Yamato reform and infuse itself into him, simultaneously unlocking a devil trigger of sorts within him in the form of a spiritual projection that could interface with the sword's power. So, this now armless Nero has a reason to want to get even with Urizen, who is keeping Yamato, and by extension his arm, levitating in a red crystal prison. He easily swats away all of Dante and Nero's attacks, only needing to raise a single arm to end their assault, forcing Nero to retreat and Dante left for dead, with his signature sword, the Rebellion, shattered. 1 month later, all of Redgrave is a ghost town, as the hive that protects Urizen, a demonic plant known as the Qlipoth, grew up into the sky while feeding on the blood of the city's citizens. Nero now returns with a mechanical arm for a rematch and to save Dante, but has to contend with an army of demons spawned from the Qlipoth, which in and of itself is a living, shifting environment made up of pumping blood. Some of these demons are even old allies, as Urizen turned both Lady and Trish into guardians protecting his domain. Once this plant has enough blood, it'll bear fruit, a single apple capable of imbuing whoever eats it with immense power. If Urizen is already this powerful, imagine the death toll if he successfully obtained this apple. All life on the planet is at risk if they fail to stop him, but all he needs to do is sit there patiently until it's had enough sacrifices. So, the meat of the game is breaking back into the Qlipoth and stopping Urizen before this can happen. V joins Nero on this mission, and the two of them frequently split up to cover more ground. He does participate in combat, but he's very fragile compared to Nero and Dante. Since he's so weak, he allows his 3 summons, a bird, panther, and golem, to do the fighting for him, commanding them and then going in for the final blow to finish enemies off with his cane. His tattoos are tied to these summons, so they fade away as he uses them. Then, when he wants to summon his powerful golem, his hair turns from black to white. He's frequently reading out of a book containing various poems and paintings from the 18th century artist William Blake. His taunts revolve around this, and he'll often quote from the book during cutscenes to draw parallels between the text and his current situation. Eventually, he finds an incapacitated Dante, and wakes him up by attempting to stab him through the eye with the sword Sparta, the signature weapon of the fabled warrior it got its namesake from. But as soon as he gets Dante back into the fight against Urizen, V's body begins to weaken further, breaking down into ash with cracks appearing in his skin. He's running out of time, but he finally decides to come clean about his origin to Trish, who was recently saved. I wanted to preserve the presentation of this twist to some degree, even though it's common knowledge at this point. But now we can drop the ambiguity and dig into the really interesting aspects of this game's story. In the wake of his defeat in DMC1, under the possession of the Demon King Mundus, Vergil was left to wander the earth, corrupted and dying. He eventually took his sword back by force, ripping off Nero's arm, and went back to his childhood home where he grew up with Dante. One of the defining moments of his childhood was this home being attacked by the hordes of demons under Mundus's control. They were looking for revenge against Sparta for his betrayal. And at one point we get a flashback where Dante remembers his mother hiding him in a closet, and then running off to find Vergil before being killed. Now desperate, Vergil can think of nothing other than getting revenge against his brother for defeating him in DMC3 as well as 1, and leaving him in this broken down state. He makes the brash decision that it's his human side weighing him down, and chooses to use the Yamato to cleave the humanity out of himself. His rejected human side would become V, whose skin and naturally white hair would become stained in Vergil's nightmares. The 3 summons V has are all based on the other bosses under Mundus's control in DMC1, those being the Griffin, Shadow, and aptly titled Nightmare. Now, without V holding him back, Vergil's body, now completely demonic, grows into the power-hungry Urizen, who sets out to obtain the Qliphothes so that he can partake in the fruit it produces. You can even hear Vergil's voice buried beneath the distortion that makes up Urizen's voice.
I am power, absolute.
Now, to some degree, I do think it's lame that, in essence, these 2 new characters introduced in this game are really Vergil. But at the same time, neither of them is supposed to be the same character, just representations of these different sides of him. They're a personification of the character's inner struggle, V being his heart, sentimentality, and memories, and Urizen being the side of him that sees those as burdens, solely focused on obtaining strength and control, because the side of him that lacked those things is the side that wasn't strong enough to save his mother or even beat his brother, which he should at least be equal to. In his heart, he feared being that scared child, who was powerless to stop his life and loved ones from being destroyed by those demonic forces. In hindsight, the name V is a not-so-subtle shorthand for Vergil, but it was also likely inspired by the book he carries around, which was one of Vergil's childhood favorites with a V or Roman numeral 5 on the cover. Knowing he can't stop his other half himself, he had to swallow his pride and get the help of Dante. When he introduces himself, he uses the guise of quoting a William Blake poem to admit that he has no real name and is only 2 days old, but cuts the tension by claiming he's only joking. When trying to convince Dante to take the job, he claims this new demon is, in his words, your reason for fighting. That's where the name Urizen comes from, because as Urizen states himself, he has no name, and doesn't know who they're talking about when they call him that. Though it's kept hidden from us as viewers, V openly reveals that Urizen's true identity is Vergil, but he keeps it a secret that he's also connected in the same way. When asked who Urizen is, you can clearly see V make the motion for Vergil with his lips before the cutscene fades to black. In order to keep their allies from panicking, they choose to use the codename Urizen to refer to this monster. Urizen is also a major figure in the mythology of William Blake's writing, tying things back to Vergil's childhood readings. Now, I'm not an expert on this subject by any means, but from what I've read up on, the Urizen of Blake's works is a god who created the material world but oppresses humanity through placing restrictions on our imagination. He represents law and is at odds with but tied to his opposite named Los, who represents our creativity. Many parallels can be drawn here with Devil May Cry, as Urizen and V contrast each other in a similar way. Urizen rejects the flawed and weak aspects of humanity with its emotionally driven logic as represented by V, and he condescends in the same way to other characters, telling them they'll regret being born useless and human. He seeks objective strength with the goal of ruling over and controlling all life in existence. Blake's Urizen isolates himself in a void where he becomes more resentful towards the nature of the world, similar to how the game's Urizen rejects love and emotional ties to family and friends, becoming an unfeeling shell of his former self. In his eyes, power is law and rules over everything. While not being Vergil himself, knowing where these views stem from, but finding himself in such a frail body compared to where he came from is a humbling experience. It must make him feel even more insecure and uncomfortable to know he needs to walk with a cane, with his body eventually falling apart at its seams. He can barely lift Sparta, and it doesn't recognize the power he once had, refusing to transform. V curses the sight of Dante knocked out after being incapable of beating Urizen, wishing he never existed because if he never got in his way, he wouldn't be in this situation. If Dante never existed, he would have never been left alone as his mom was killed. How frustrating must it be for him that the one time he needs the help of the guy who repeatedly beat him, he isn't able to beat this new villain who's an extension of him? How weak does that make him look in his original form? By separating himself from his vengeful side, he's granted the clarity to realize what he did was wrong. He curses the fact that he threw his life away, blinded by the pursuit of power. When asking for advice, Trish says she isn't his mother, which is an interesting point because he's looking at someone who was originally created by Mundus to look like his mother, as a way to manipulate Dante in the first game. It must be a head trip for him to see this woman for the first time, since he longs for closure with his mom, but the resemblance is just a facade. They hint at his identity even before this reveal when he's asked about the topic of his mom in the middle of a level, showing how much her memory haunts him.
Awfully quiet, V. Thinking about Mommy Dearest?
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. But the past is a bitter place for me.
Unlike Dante, Nero doesn't know Urizen's been spawned by Vergil's actions. But when he eventually arrives for a rematch, he's finally able to land a single hit on him, slicing through his palm. While V remembers being Vergil, Urizen had no use for those ideas shackling him. But every so often, something triggers one of these deeply buried remnants of his previous existence. For example, when Dante says jackpot during their first meeting, something the two brothers would say as kids, Dante's identity is conjured up within him and he's able to recall his name. This slice to the hand is one of those moments, calling back to DMC3 when Vergil sliced Dante's hand to keep him away. The second time happened as he denied Dante's help and allowed himself to fall into hell at the end of the game. His decision to follow his demonic side and stick with that choice even after being defeated is what led to Urizen standing here in this moment. And whether he fully remembers this or not, some residual memory is calling out to him from the back of his mind as he looks down at his palm. But he isn't that weak anymore, and the wound immediately heals as if it was never there to begin with. This annoys him enough to actually make him get up from his throne, and we get to see how much he towers over our characters. I really like the tone of red the room begins to glow as the spiral behind Urizen unravels, opening up the roof and letting daylight shine in. As he moves forward, he rips free from the organic tubes attached to him. These were hooking him directly into the Qlipoth, which was pumping him full of power using the blood it was collecting from the city. For the narrative to run its course, you're supposed to fail against this second form of the boss, just like you're supposed to lose to him in the prologue. But surprisingly, you can actually power through both of these intentionally difficult moments and win, ending the game right there. It's really cool that they let you immediately beat the game if you're good enough, and you're rewarded with the next difficulty being unlocked early since you've already proven you're ready for it. It always sucks when you're going up against a boss that you're intended to lose when it isn't telegraphed as such. So you end up wasting your time and resources trying to win just to learn it was pointless. But it's always awesome to learn that you weren't forced to lose in a situation like that, and that you can challenge yourself to actually beat them next time to get a bonus. As Nero fights the new mobile version of this boss, Dante makes his way back to his childhood home, the same place Vergil split his soul. The place is destroyed, either from his initial transformation into Urizen, or from the chaos unleashed by the Qlipoth, but either way, it reflects the current state of their family's legacy. In a similar vein to Vergil stabbing himself with the Yamato, Dante does the same with the shattered remains of rebellion. This causes it to combine with his father's sword Sparta, fusing within him and unlocking a new form called Sin Devil Trigger. Even though Nero put up more of a fight this time, he still isn't able to take down Urizen. But thankfully, Dante in his enhanced form arrives to save him, battling against his corrupted brother once more. Urizen likes to whip around the leftover roots of the Qlipoth and attack with more directed tentacles that track towards you, which kinda remind me of the tentacle attacks Arkham used at the end of DMC3. Along with his powerful new sword, Dante's able to knock Urizen back. But instead of continuing the fight, Urizen realizes the plant's fruit is ready for consumption. So he makes his exit, teleporting through a wall of blood and leaving Dante alone. They all rush down into the depths of this structure to try to stop Urizen before he can reach his full potential, with the power condensed into a single apple. To put the threat into perspective, long ago the fruit was even used by Mundus, enabling him to rule the underworld. And like the first domino falling, his reign would lead to the traumatic events of Dante and Vergil's childhood, and by extension result in the current mess they're in now. V's body continues to deteriorate to the point where he's close to death and needs to be carried to the finish line by Nero. All the while, he's confessing the things that drove him to seek out power as Vergil. He wanted to be loved and protected by his family. But after being left alone in a cold world, his survival instinct kicked in, and gaining strength to compensate for his loneliness became his only recourse. He reveals to Nero that Urizen is Vergil, but he doesn't mention that he too is part of Vergil alongside him, and Dante still doesn't know that fact either. When he arrives at the core of the plant, he finds Urizen admiring the fruit like a work of art, savoring the moment before he becomes king. The environment around them is some sort of projection of his inner psyche, manifesting as a pristine version of their childhood home, even though Urizen admits himself that he has no idea what this place is meant to be.
It's all an illusion, created by this extraordinary fruit.
I believe this is the result of him being connected to the Qlipoth as it formed. It sort of reflects its master, the current holder of the Yamato. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I've always thought the trunk of the Qlipoth resembled the cross-patterned handle of the Yamato itself, piercing the ground. Of course, these rings are typical for many palm-type plants, but I think it's an intentional design choice here connecting the characters. Whether it's supposed to be a literal similarity justified within the universe, or just one made by the designers to plant that seed in our mind before Urizen's identity is actually revealed. Like ripples of Urizen's scattered memories, many of his servants sport similar names and designs to his corrupted Nello Angelo persona. V gets angry when he first sees a group of these Angelo enemy types, since it causes him to remember his time under Mundus's control. Symbolically, he's fighting against his own past. And in a similar way these familiars were created, I always interpreted these enemies as being twisted creations from Urizen's subconscious, either by Urizen directly or by the power of the tree. Dante tries to appeal to his humanity, claiming that their mother never abandoned Vergil and searched for him until she was killed by Mundus's demonic forces. This might have made Vergil even angrier, causing him to blame himself for his mother's death, if it weren't for the fact that Urizen lacks those memories completely. He turns his attention back to the fruit, eating it before Dante can stop him. This surge of power causes him to shed the armor around his body like a cocoon, revealing a hardened demonic colossus underneath. His body is made up of giant mouths and eyes that shift around, and I think it's a really cool design motif. The two of them do battle now that Urizen can match Dante's Sin Devil Trigger abilities. I like that even though he's so big, he still fights with a hand-to-hand style. almost kickboxing Dante as he sends out explosions of energy. As they fight, the environment shatters like a mirror, reflecting the souls of these brothers. And as Urizen takes more and more damage, those residual echoes of his original identity get conjured up, with him questioning how Dante can be so powerful when he never lost anything like he did, feeling his strength is motivated by his tragedy. Instead, Dante's rebuttal is that strength comes from the desire to protect those you care for, and not for oneself. And just like that, Dante defeats him once again, just as Nero and V arrive to witness his end. Since V has kept the fact that he's the other half of Vergil secret from the other two, they let him approach Urizen. They think he wants to finish him off himself, but really, he plans on reuniting with his other self. As soon as they realize something isn't right, it's too late, with V stabbing Urizen, combining with him and becoming Vergil once more, free of the corruption that was previously killing him. The environment falls apart around them as Vergil examines the book V was carrying around, remembering it from his childhood. Dante is the first to attack, and the brothers immediately start fighting again, but reach a stalemate. Vergil claims beating him right now after he just went all out fighting the powered-up Urizen wouldn't be fair, telling him to recompose himself and then meet him at the top of the Qliphotht for their final battle. He slices open another portal, but before he leaves, he actually thanks Nero, remembering the help he gave him while he was dying as V. This is the first evidence of how much his time in that depowered state gave him a new perspective and sense of compassion. Dante wants Nero to stay out of this, revealing for the first time that Vergil is in fact Nero's father. This is something even Vergil isn't aware of, so when he thanks him, he's not compelled to do it out of a familial connection, but genuinely appreciates it. Of course, there were major hints at Nero being Vergil's son in DMC4, but it was nice to get some definitive confirmation. While Dante always had a personal connection to wanting to stop Urizen and by extension Vergil, now even Nero is invested in stopping him beyond just getting his arm back. Far above the city, Vergil looks down at the destruction his darker half caused, similarly to the way he would in DMC3. But this time he's conflicted, asking if his goals were a product of his tragic upbringing, and whether he and Dante would have had each other's lives if their positions were reversed as kids. He simply waits for Dante's arrival, as a throne grows up from the Qliphotht for him to take his seat on. As Dante makes his way there, he defeats the three familiars that were bound to V since they were now free to stand in his way. Once he makes it to the top, they quickly resume where they'd left off all those years ago. They've fought so many times that neither of them can keep count anymore. This battle is really similar to our last real fight with him, but I like how the environment is so heavenly compared to how hellish and chaotic the arena was there. One of the big differences is how he'll match Dante with his own Sin Devil trigger, flying around the area before striking. The in-game notes imply this is the result of the power gained from the fruit he ate, so it's good to see he got something out of that deal. He also inherited the doppelganger ability his character had in the 2013 reboot, which is a decent takeaway if they were going to take any inspiration from that game. During the fight, Dante lets it slip that Nero is his son, and initially he says that means nothing to him, but they break for a moment and he reconsiders that, asking for confirmation, and he seems to look back at that part of his past with some sense of sentimentality. At the same time, Nero makes a call and gets reassurance from his loved one, Kyrie, giving him the energy to make it to the top. Just like Dante mentioned, protecting others is what gives him strength, the same can be said for Nero. And his desire to protect Kyrie and his newfound family finally unlocks his true devil trigger, regrowing his arm in the process. Right as Dante and Vergil burst towards each other to clash once again, Nero drops down and stops the two of them. This stuns them, but Nero isn't gonna stand back and let these brothers continue to try to kill each other just because it's all they've ever known. They think it's the only way to solve their differences, so Nero needs to use their logic to knock their heads together to advocate for peace. Vergil chuckles and asks if it counts as his win if he beats Nero since he just beat Dante. He agrees, and this is a great opportunity for Nero to let out some frustration over his father never being there for him, with an explosive middle finger as he unleashes his devil trigger. As you can tell, this whole ending is much more cheeky and lighthearted than the end of DMC3, but a lot of discussion of Vergil's character in this game seems to misunderstand who he is at the end of his journey here. It's understandable since Vergil's literal screen time makes up a very small amount of the game's run, and you need to extrapolate his perspective from what you learn from his two sides. The whole game was about exploring his character in a unique way, where his vulnerable side was forced to witness the monster he thought he wanted to become. V was able to express himself in a way Vergil would have never done, since he's normally more introverted and reserved with his feelings. People absolutely wanted to see Vergil return in the series and get closure on what happened to his character after the first game, especially with Nero being his son. But this was a much more interesting way to present that story than just having him seek power at the top of a tower again, which would have been criticized as redundant. You can't really blame Vergil for the split decision to divide his soul when he was corrupted, dying, and running low on time. In that wretched state, his intentions were to let that human side of him die, but only through that empathetic side of him recognizing where he went wrong in life and rallying help was his demonic side stopped. Once he's reformed, it's almost like those two sides of him come together to offer their arguments for what to do moving forward. And that's why he contemplates what direction to take at the top of the Qlipoth. Battling Dante isn't a matter of taking over the world or not, it's purely about settling the score, establishing superiority in their endless rivalry. He sees battling Nero as an extension of that, while Nero sees it as his chance to force his father to acknowledge his strength. Something he's felt the need to prove since the beginning of the game when he was overlooked and called dead weight by Dante. He gets beaten several times here, but it doesn't make him throw a tantrum like he might have in the past. He's too old for that now, and he's gained too much maturity through his experience and the perspective gained from his time as V. This reformed Vergil can no longer be considered a villain. And that's why once Nero knocks him down and points out this tree needs to be stopped before anyone else dies, he quickly recomposes himself and shifts his attention to what's really important. He and Dante agree to head into the underworld, killing the Qlipoth and resealing the entrance behind them, which will trap the brothers in hell. They're trusting Nero to keep the human world safe while they're gone, and when he tries to object, they both return the favor from earlier by punching him in the face. Before he goes, Vergil tells him he won't lose next time, not as a threat, but a promise that he'll return to test his son's strength one day. And as one last goodbye, he tosses his childhood book to him as a memento to remember him both as his father and as his friend V. We see later that they were successful in cutting the tree down. And in classic DMC fashion, you get to fight alongside him as the credits roll, with the goal of killing more enemies than him. But once the threat of the Qlipoth is taken care of, they go back to battling to see who's better, without Nero there to stop them. It's clearly just for the thrill and bragging rights, not to actually kill each other, with them playfully arguing over who has more points in this endless game. This is the relationship we only got a small glimpse of when they worked together to beat Arkham at the end of DMC 3. And just like that, as they're attacked by demons and break up their fighting to defend themselves, Dante ends the game in the signature way, much to Vergil's embarrassment.
Don't you dare say it! Jackpot!
I wouldn't be surprised if the next entry just focused on Nero and some other new characters. But even if Vergil did reappear, you shouldn't expect to see him as a villain. That misguided side of him is behind him now. He spent potentially decades subjugated by the power of the same guy who killed his mother. And then he got to see the horrors his viewpoint would have brought to the world from a more compassionate perspective. In the Vergil campaign they made for the special edition of the game, they added and replaced a few different cutscenes, including one of these last ones where they changed the dialogue so Vergil seems far more irritated by Dante's comments. I'm not sure what their intentions were with these alterations, but their relationship seems far more shaky compared to the main game. It just seems like a strange decision, paired with how weird these pre-rendered reanimated scenes look compared to the rest of the game's visuals. I think to some degree they could have spent more time explaining what Vergil was doing between the aftermath of DMC 1 and the start of 5, since I'm assuming years passed between Mundus's defeat and Vergil finally going to get the Yamato back. Though I don't blame him for what Urizen ended up doing, I do think Vergil should feel a sense of responsibility to make up for the suffering that side of him caused as a result of his actions. And that means more than just bringing things back to neutral by stopping the Qlipoth. especially if we add in the death toll caused by his actions in DMC3. Though that's harder to quantify since nothing was really shown on screen, making the damage that caused a bit more nebulous. Plus, you might even consider his decades spent tormented as Nello Angelo to be enough punishment to make up for that. Devil May Cry 5 feels like the first game in the series whose narrative actually feels like the culmination of previously established plot points. Picking up on elements that DMC1 left open, the backstory established in DMC3, and the addition of Nero in DMC4. It ties all of these pieces together into one narrative that caps it all off and leaves things open for a future that can go anywhere. I think more than any other entry, this one lends itself to more symbolic interpretations, by leaning so heavily into the metaphorical narratives of William Blake's poetry, and with the idea of V and Urizen being separate entities representing one whole being. Instead of going through ancient stone structures, its environments are living and organic, with the ability to project the memories of the characters within it. Initially, I was afraid Urizen was just gonna be a really strong villain of the week, who just came out of nowhere without any mention previously and was just way more powerful than anyone we faced before. But thankfully, his presence was elevated with this unique take on exploring Vergil's mindset. It was a risky choice bringing this character back and continuing his character arc, but I think they pulled it off, successfully continuing the legend.